Auwaerter, I just want to ask you my first question. How does promoting our understanding of the novel coronavirus's origins help us prevent and prepare for future pandemics?
Well, I think there are two main avenues. One is if it is of animal origin, we need to anticipate additional viruses or even potentially bacteria, and therefore having an advanced notice, an early notice as possible, certainly is helpful for containment and also mitigation measures. This, no doubt, would need to be cooperation with other countries, public health agencies, to build that infrastructure. On the other hand, if it's a lab-derived virus, then guidance in terms of proper research and guardrails is highly important to make sure, to the best of abilities, this never happens again, much as we take great care with airline safety, nuclear weapons, and so on. All that needs to be paid attention to.
Thank you. Dozens of scientific research studies have been completed or are currently underway to promote our understanding of how the novel coronavirus came to be. Under President Biden's leadership, and we heard a little bit from our colleague, Mr. Raskin, about President Trump's initial response to this, but under President Biden's leadership, the intelligence community has taken decisive action to get to the bottom of the novel coronavirus's origins. And we have seen some new releases from different departments about their ongoing findings. Dr. Auwaerter, can you tell us about the importance of the objectivity of these investigations?
Well, as a clinician and someone that does research, I think the objectivity is very important. Obviously, not all information is available to us that has based the conclusions. That's outside of my expertise as to whether that's the case, but I think the objectivity is highly important, and also the fact of how it's rated. You know, low confidence means exactly what I think it means, that there's a fair amount of uncertainty.
Okay, final question. Congressional investigations designed to villainize or discredit public health experts undermine our public health institutions and sometimes can spread dangerous misinformation, which itself can metastasize. Dr. Auwaerter, instead of launching a partisan investigation or politicizing the pandemic's origin, what should Congress be doing to prevent something like this from happening again?
Well, outside of the political realm, I would just say an independent body would make the most sense that is not hewing essentially or have an ability to make much political hay, if that's possible. I'm not sure of the details of that, but to me that seems to be the ideal.
Thank you very much. I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to my colleague, Congressman Mfume.
Oh, thank you very, very much for that. I want to go back and underscore, if I might, how I began my comments, because I don't want that lost on those who are here or those who are watching. This is designed, and again, I want to commend the chair and the ranking member Ruiz for making sure that we move down a path together, Democrats and Republicans trying to get answers for the American people, not just about what happened, but as has been said, so that it never happens again. And if it does, we're prepared. And I put so much emphasis on science because I spent 5 years at the NIH, at the Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities. I was the executive director of the National Medical Association. And up until 2 years ago, I've served as vice president of Research America, the largest research advocacy organization in the country. This is real to me. This is very personal. And I can't even fathom the thought of people still dying as a result of this until we have our work completed. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Lesko from Arizona for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In Rep. Ruiz's opening statement, he said he doesn't want the COVID investigation to be political. I couldn't agree more. Yet in the next breath, he accused one of the witnesses of writing a white supremacist book, which is political salvo designed to discredit the witness. Then his first question wasn't about COVID-19 at all. It was all about a non-COVID related book that Dr. Wade wrote in the past, and a poster board was held over his head designed for political theater. Then Rep. Raskin went after President Trump for 5 minutes instead of asking a question. With all due respect, I contend that some of my Democratic colleagues are the ones making the COVID investigation political. Why they don't want to investigate the origins of COVID-19 that killed millions of people, I will never understand. My first question is for Dr. Redfield. A witness in our roundtable last week said that it was a no-brainer that the virus came from the Wuhan lab. When you were director of the CDC, did Dr. Fauci ever explain to you why he didn't believe the virus came from the Wuhan lab and why he actively worked to silence that theory?
Dr. Fauci's position, as those who thought a spillover, took the position that it was most likely a spillover event because that's what happened with SARS and that's what happened with MERS, right? And I think it's important to look at, prior to 2012, we didn't really have another mechanism other than nature. We weren't doing gain-of-function research, right? I'm a clinical virologist. I tried to explain to Dr. Fauci, who's an immunologist, that this virus, SARS and MERS, when they infected man from the intermediate host, civet cat in the case of SARS and a camel in the case of MERS, they never learned how to go human to human. So those original outbreaks were less than 1,000 people, and the epidemics died. And so when everyone thought this was SARS-like, well, it's gonna die too. But this virus was immediately the most infectious virus, not the most, I think probably right behind measles, virus that we've ever seen infect man. So I immediately said, wait a second, this isn't natural. And then you go back and look at the literature and you find in 2014, this lab actually published a paper that they put the H2 receptor into humanized mice so it can infect human tissue. And then you learn that the new COVID, which came from bats, now can hardly replicate in bats.
Yeah.
So how does that happen? So I said that my view as a virologist, again, my hypothesis, and I never discredited them for their hypothesis, it's the spillover, was that this was most likely to come from the lab. And we need to aggressively investigate both hypotheses.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have another question for you, Dr. Redfield. In a recent Energy and Commerce Oversight hearing, I asked the NIH acting director about the NIH's gross negligence in monitoring the EcoHealth Alliance grant and subgrant to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He admitted that we might not have had all of the information and research reports from WIV and EcoHealth. He insisted, however, that he was sure that the coronavirus research at WIV was completely unrelated to SARS-CoV-2. With the information we know and the fact that China deleted data and asked NIH to delete data, do you believe that we can have certainty that the virus did not come from the Wuhan lab and that U.S. funding was not used for COVID-19 related research?
Yeah, absolutely, we can't do that. I will say, if you go back and look, it's declassified now, and I'm sure you all have your classified briefings, but the declassified information now, in September of 2019, 3 things happened in that lab. One is they deleted the sequences. Was highly irregular. So researchers don't usually like to do that. Second thing they did was they changed the command and control of the lab from the civilian control to the military control. Highly unusual, and I've been involved in dual-use labs when I was in the military. And the third things they did, which I think is really telling, is they let a contractor redo the ventilation system in that laboratory. So I think clearly there was strong evidence that there was a significant event that happened in that laboratory in September. It's now been declassified. You can read it. I'm sure there's more classified information around it.
Thank you. Dr. Redfield, the New York Post reported that you stated, I could use the word cover up, but I don't know that, so I'm not going to speculate that. Do you believe there was a cover-up? And if so, why would federal agencies work with legacy media to silence scientists and other Americans asking questions about the origins of SARS-CoV-2?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of quoting the New York Post. I don't think I used the word cover-up. Okay, I think there was an attempt to misguide, redirect the debate, but I wouldn't have used the word cover-up.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Now recognize Dr. Barra from California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From day one of this pandemic, unfortunately, politics has kind of infused a lot of this. And I know this, obviously, Dr. Redfield, you and I had many conversations. In my time in Congress, one of my focus areas has been global health security, pandemic preparedness. Have sat on national task forces at CSIS to prepare for global health securities. We put out our recommendations, unfortunately, in the fall of 2019, and have pushed to put that framework in place. My colleagues, Congresswoman Dingell and Congresswoman Ross, have equivocally said, as Democrats, we want to find out what the origins of COVID were. Early on in the pandemic, in January of 2020, I pushed personally as hard as I could on the Trump administration to do everything they could to get our scientists to the hot zone, to ground zero, to actually get a sense of what was going on. I'm not going to defend how the Chinese Communist Party has handled this pandemic. They've stonewalled us. They've played politics. Dr. Metzl, you talked about the importance of the WHO. They played politics with the WHO recommendations, and until we actually can get to the hot zone, until we, I don't know that we'll ever get the data. This is not a partisan issue. In fact, on the Intelligence Committee, which the chairman is on, we marked up the COVID-19 Origins Act in a nonpartisan way. It passed, out of markup with a voice vote. We will all get a chance to vote on that bill on Friday. I think you will see a strong bipartisan vote encouraging the intelligence community to declassify as much information as possible so the public can see the information that we have. It's not conclusive, but we've got to continue to try to find the COVID origins. I think it is reprehensible that we're disparaging, some of our greatest public health individuals, Dr. Fauci, who I've known for a long time, and Francis Collins, who I've gotten to know. Both are outstanding scientists and so forth. They may have had a different hypothesis. We should entertain all hypotheses, and we should do it in an objective way to find the answers. I also hope we don't, as a body, take the wrong lessons from this. Dr. Metzl, you talked about the importance of the WHO. I'd like your opinion on international collaboration is extremely important, not just in pandemic preparedness, but also in biosecurity work and so forth. We have to have the systems in place to identify pandemics fairly quickly, to think about how we address it, because whether this was man-made or naturally occurring, bad actors are out there who just saw what a virus did to the entire planet. Those technologies are readily available. You come from a national security background. How important is it to work with our international partners here?
It's absolutely essential that we work with our international partners and with the WHO, and as has been said repeatedly, when those international partners or potential partners themselves are bad actors, which is absolutely the case with China, that makes things a lot more difficult. And then the World Health Organization, which is absolutely essential, is working with one hand tied behind its back. It doesn't have the mandate or the authority to do what it needs to do. It couldn't have its own independent surveillance capability in the beginning of the pandemic when China was preventing the WHO investigators from going to Wuhan. There was nothing that they could do. And as I said in my remarks, Dr. Tedros has actually really been at the forefront of fighting for the kind of open inquiry that the Chinese government has so aggressively blocked. And if I can just say, just very quickly, I'm originally from Kansas City. I'm a Midwestern optimist, and so I hear some consensus in the room that it's critically important to understand how the pandemic started, that we have to fully examine all origin hypotheses. It's my view, as I've said before, that China must be the primary focus, but we also have to look at everything, including ourselves. But if we make this process primarily about Dr. Fauci, even though we need to look at everything, if we make it primarily about Dr. Fauci, we will be inappropriately serving the Chinese government a propaganda coup on a silver platter.
I couldn't agree with you more. Let's get to the facts. Let's discover the origins. Let's do what we can to prevent the next pandemic. Let's increase our safety and biosecurity. You know, we should debate gain of function research. I think that's totally appropriate. We should make sure if we are looking at that it is done in an absolute safe way with oversight, et cetera. We should also think about the private sector that can operate, you know, and do this research on their own. We ought to think about how we also look at that and make that safer. Thank you.
Now I recognize Mr. Cloud for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for your work in science and for yielding your wisdom in this effort to us today. Dr. Metzl, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that there were scientists who refused to be silenced, insinuating that there were efforts to silence. And I was just wondering if you could kind of brief what some of those efforts were that you saw.
Sure. So when a small handful of us in the earliest days of the pandemic began raising the possibility of a possible lab origin, there was just, as I said, ferociously strong headwinds. There was this manufactured consensus, and I kept digging. And like I said before, I'm a lifelong Democrat. I consider myself a progressive person, but I kept digging. I couldn't find the justification for these strong arguments, calling people like me investigating, looking into pandemic origins in good faith conspiracy theorists. And it was very difficult. So we had a small group that formed later in 2020 that others have called the Paris Group. All of the members of that community were aggressively trying to place scientific papers with journals and had zero success. So there was a wall that was extremely difficult to get over, which is why what I said to this group is, look, we have to try to get around that wall, and that's why we published our 4 open letters that I believe played a significant role in along with other things, of starting to shift this conversation. But it took more than a year of this kind of aggressive work to even start to begin that type of change.
And some of that pushback came from our government, too. Is that correct?
Well, it was mixed. I mean, certainly from what we've heard, there were leaders of the United States government who, Dr. Fauci had said he was open to all possibilities, but then the next sentence was, the preponderance of science suggests a natural origin. I'm a fan of Dr. Fauci, but I don't like to scream at the television, but when I heard those words, I would say, well, no. Right. That's not the case. That's not what the science, at least as I'm reading it, is saying.
To what you were just saying, Forbes mentioned you as one of the first, as an ex-high official, high-level staffer for Bill Clinton, and then Senator Joe Biden to say that SARS coronavirus was likely a Wuhan lab escapee. Why did you think that?
Yeah. So in the early days of January of 2020, like everybody, I was trying to figure out what was happening. And I read the news reports, and it said it comes from the market. And SARS-2 sounded kind of like SARS-1, and that seemed credible. But I had just been in Wuhan, China. And so I think a lot of Americans had this vision of Wuhan as some little market town where a bunch of yokels are eating bats for dinner every night. But Wuhan is China's Chicago. It's an incredibly sophisticated, highly educated, wealthy city. I knew that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was based there. I knew a lot about that background. I also had an understanding both of the science and of China. And then on January 24th of 2020, there was a Lancet paper written by Chinese scientists saying that more than a third of the earliest cases of infection were of people who had no connection to the market. And so in my mind, that was a pretty strong piece of evidence that the market was a super spreader place, which certainly is what I still believe. And that was when I started digging. And then in later February of 2020, I had all of these ideas I was developing. I went to South Africa for the meeting of our World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. And this is with some of the top scientists and others in the world. And then privately, I was telling people, like, here is my private view. Here's what I'm seeing in the evidence. And there was a part of me that was kind of hoping that they would say, oh, no, you're crazy, here's what you're missing, because this is an uncomfortable hypothesis for many reasons. That wasn't, that certainly nobody was saying that, and that was why when I came back after those meetings, I became very, very public, and then I launched my website and wrote a number of editorials in March and early April.
I wanted to try to get another question
Yeah, sorry.
here. Your take on this, was that before or after Proximal Origins came out?
So
And what was your take on that when you, I guess, read that?
Yeah.
And what impact do you think that had on the scientific community and the free discovery, so to speak, of...
It's a great question, and just I don't mean to be overly reference my own background, but I'm pro-science, pro-vaccine. I believe climate change is real. But when I saw that, I was monumentally, I'll say upset, angry, because without the available evidence, these absolute claims were being made. And I was really digging, and there just wasn't the evidence to make those assertions. So the right position in the beginning was what everybody is saying now. It could have been a natural origin, it could have been a lab origin, and we need to actively and aggressively investigate all relevant hypotheses. And it's very unfortunate that wasn't the case.
Yeah, of course, the question we'll have to get to later is why was this, all the data deleted and everything?